Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm delighted to be joined by Paula Leach, who'll be presenting on Vantage Points, the simple equation for leadership. In a moment, I'll pass over to Paula to start the webinar, but before I do, I'd just like to mention that today's webinar will feature a few polls and a Q&A section at the end. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please type these into the chat function, and we hope to answer all these during the Q&A section. For any unanswered questions, don't worry, Paula has kindly agreed to reach out to you following the webinar with her answers. Just to let you all know, the session is being recorded, and a week from today, you'll receive an email which will include the link to gain access to the recording to obviously review the session again. So without further ado, I'll now pass over to Paula to begin the session.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for joining, everybody. It's absolutely lovely to be with you and to have the opportunity to share some thinking around leadership. And just in terms of an introduction to myself, my background is that I have over 25 years experience in the people space. I spent a large portion of my career working for Ford Motor Company, and that was all across all different disciplines in the organisation and geographically. So I also spent some time working internationally in the States as well. And following on from that, I've actually then worked in public sector. So I was the Chief People Officer at the Home Office in the UK, and I sat on the executive committee there and was also part of cross-governmental strategies and organisations looking at people and the people issues across that system. And then more latterly, I've been Global Chief People Officer for FDM Group, which is a FTSE 250 technical resourcing organisation that was really focused on making a difference with regard to diversity and tech skill sets for the future. So really, really interesting. And at the back end of last year, I actually decided to set up my own company. So I'm an executive coach. I consult and work with organisations around people, leadership, change and transformation. So anything from culture to strategic workforce planning, diversity and inclusion, and talent and succession. They're kind of the areas that I tend to focus on. I have a small foundation that I set up, which is all about supporting young professional women. And we provide pro bono coaching and mentoring for young women just starting out in their professional careers, which is so exciting. And finally, I wrote a book. And so my book is called Vantage Points. And that book was published in February this year. And some of the content of that book I'm going to be sharing with you today, which is just some thinking around leadership. Sometimes we think of it as really getting back to what's the point of leadership. And so I know all of you are leaders in your own right. You'll also be interested in developing leaders in the future and also supporting leaders around you to be the best that they can be. And so I hope that there are some thoughts in here that you can take away with you. Leadership can be complicated at times. And hopefully from the vantage point that I have had, supporting leaders across all different disciplines at different levels in organisations and in different organisational settings over the last few years, as well as being an executive leader myself, is something that I can share with you to simplify that and enjoy the process of leading others. So what we're going to do is just jump into that today. The agenda for today is that we're just going to touch on context just briefly. This is all stuff that we all know, but I just wanted to put this thoughts about leadership into the context of the working world today. Then we're going to talk about you, the leader. So you as a leader or leaders that you are working with and supporting. And then I'm going to share with you just at high level the vantage points that I actually talk about in the book in a lot more detail, but I wanted to just bring to you some of the highlights around that and the things that you have at your disposal as a leader. So that's what we're going to cover today. So let's start with this, context of the working world. And if you think about being a leader today, the backdrop against which we are leading is fast-paced and changing rapidly. So we've got all sorts of technological change. It's been happening for the last 30, 40 years, but the pace of that technological change is very, very fast. There's lots of social changes that are happening and social expectations that we are leading it. And you've got to think about leadership as a social endeavour. So those social changes may be happening outside of the workplace or in the workplace, but we as leaders are in the business of people. And so any social changes are hugely important to us. And map on top of that some of the cultural shifts that are happening. You know, everything that we might have experienced over the course of the last few years, whether it's the Me Too movement, whether it might be something following the tragic death of George Floyd, those cultural aspects are part of our conversation as a leader like never before. Goes without saying that health and well-being is moved up the agenda from a leadership perspective in the workplace compared to what it might have been 18 months ago. And although we might have always been concerned broadly with our employees and how they're feeling and their well-being, and that was on the rise as an agenda item, that's now right at the top of our agenda. We've got global entrants. So our businesses are just shaped and changed all of the time because of the different nature of how we're working on a global scale. We've got political disruption, so that affects us in terms of our business, whether you're a global business and you're having to deal with things that are changing in different parts of the world, or some of that political disruption is actually resulting in things like increased regulation or changes. And then on top of that, obviously, we've got economic impacts. So, you know, that's always going to be the case. But if you put all of that in a melting pot together, that's the backdrop against which we are creating leadership and momentum in the modern working world. So having acknowledged that, let's think about you as the leader. So here you are. I often represent the leader as this kind of little yellow dot, emanating inspiration to everybody that you work with. So here you are as the leader. And so what is it that you are also doing? So you are responsible for coordinating the work that needs to get done. You're the coordination point for some form of output. You'll also be dealing with problems. So I don't know for any of those of you in your leadership positions, but certainly as a leader myself, you know, a huge part of my day would be solving problems. I've got to motivate the team. So I've got to think about the team. I've got to engage that team. I've got to make sure that everybody is operating at the best of their capacity. Then on top of that, I'm a coordinating point for other stakeholders. So whatever our team is responsible for, I am also outward facing, managing those different stakeholders, sometimes being a buffer between those stakeholders and what we're doing in the work of the team. And that's my work of today, but I've also got to strategize for tomorrow. So I've got to be ahead of that. I've got to be thinking ahead. I've got to be planning for the future and working on my strategy. And then I've also got responsibility. I have to demonstrate, whether it's productivity, whether it's efficiency, whether it's putting a business case together to demonstrate what we want in terms of looking for resources. I've got to have an evaluative part of my job. So I've got to be able to evaluate things. So that's my landscape as a leader. And here's my team. So we're working on that together. But that landscape can feel quite heavy. You know, bear in mind I've got that context in the background we just spoke about. And then this is what I'm doing in terms of leading my team. So there's quite a heavy load of things. But let's then just add a little bit more of that context into this picture. So I'm doing all of these things, but also in today's modern working world, we have to lead with purpose. So I'm not just doing things because that's the way we do things. You know, we know that the next generation is coming through into the workplace. If we want to be an attractive employer, you know, we have to focus on purpose. This is also an expectation for us, having a more social conscience as whatever we do as an organisation. So meaning, making sure that the work we do has meaning, I have to bring that. I've got a responsibility to think about environment and sustainability in my role, even if my role isn't, you know, specifically responsible for environment. We are all responsible for it in a greater sense today. So I've got to be thinking about those things. We just spoke about well-being in that broader context. So I've got to do all of these things, but I've also got to do that with maintaining a focus on making sure everybody stays well. And then we might have increased regulation. You know, we might have all sorts of extra requirements for reporting or audit or making sure that we're meeting certain requirements. So we've got that regulatory aspect as well. And in addition to that, you know, we're also focusing on agility, aren't we, as organisations? So as a leader, I now got to kind of balance all of that by managing flexible, and whether it's anything from flexible work patterns to flexible workplaces to just general agility in the way we approach work and how our teams approach work. There's great opportunity in this, but there's also lots to consider from a managerial leadership perspective. And in addition to that, I want to be inclusive. I really want to make sure as a leader that I'm creating the conditions where everybody can bring of their best. We have lots of diverse perspectives and everybody feels included. And that really requires me to focus on how I lead and how I create those conditions. Because obviously, I've got my preferences as well in terms of how I work. So I have to be really conscious of that and lead with inclusion. And then there might be layered on top of that, some form of restructuring. I mean, organizations are constantly in a state of change, responding to this fast-paced moving work environment. So restructuring to make sure that we've got resources in the right place and managing the processes of that is something I'm also having to lead. So this might not be exhaustive, but generally speaking, what it highlights is that context and the role of the leader is increasingly feeling quite heavy. And to manage this the way that we've always managed things can be quite challenging to keep up. And so what I'm interested in doing is exploring how we can simplify that for ourselves, achieve these things, but not become overwhelmed with them. So let's just think about that. So I'm the leader and I've got this kind of tension happening. So this tension between these expectations of me as a leader, everything we've just spoken about, and what it takes to feel thriving and fulfilled. Because what we do know is that as a leader, whatever we do, however we feel, whatever we are, is magnified in terms of what happens within our team. Our energy is the energy of our team and the people around us. So it's really important that we actually do think about ourselves in terms of feeling thriving and fulfilled. And that tension between these expectations and us having that sense of real contentment and fulfillment can sometimes feel like it's a tension. So I thought at this stage it might be interesting just to kind of get a little bit of your sense when you think about this, a bit of self-reflection. So I'm really interested in what are the top 3 expectations of you, do you think? So we're going to bring up the first poll. So Paul, if we can bring up the first poll here, have a little look at this list and have a think about what are the 3 key expectations of you as a leader? And we've got an option here at the bottom for other as well, because it may well be that amongst this list of things, there's something else. So here's a poll, and I'd love you to have a little look through and choose your top 3.
Excellent, thank you, Paula. So we've got the poll open to everyone, so we'll just give it a few moments for everyone to answer. Like what Paula said, if you are going to select other, it would be great to obviously drop in your response into the chat function, and we'll be able to pass that on to Paula. Just to reiterate, we will have a Q&A section at the end, so if you are thinking of any questions throughout this webinar, please drop them into the Q&A function or the chat, and we hopefully get a chance to answer all those questions at the end. So we've got, just give it a few more moments for everyone to answer. Excellent. So I'll just share the results with everyone.
Lovely. Thank you.
Can you see that, Paula?
Yeah, I can see it.
Excellent.
Thank you. That's
Perfect.
Fantastic. That's fantastic. So it's good to kind of look at this, isn't it, across the board for all of us to see what we might think and what other people might be thinking in terms of response to this question. And solving problems is obviously 64% of people are saying that that's something. I mean, I can totally relate to that. It kind of takes over sometimes, doesn't it? That sort of feeling in reactive mode and being able to kind of make sure you're doing that can sometimes take you away. But what it looks like on here is a reasonable distribution actually across all of you of these different aspects of what you feel the expectation is of you as a leader, and maybe just have a reflection on that, things that you sort of highlighted, etc. Paul, were there any things that particularly came up in the chat function on this?
Nothing yet.
Okay, perfect. All right. Might be that you're thinking of those things and absolutely share them as we go along. So perhaps we can close that one down. And I'll just take that off my screen as well. And then I just wanted to, oops. ask you the second question on the balance of that, which, given they're the top expectations of you as a leader, what are the top 3 things that keep you thriving and fulfilled? So let's open up this poll. So here you can see lots of different things. And again, in other section, what are the 3 main aspects on this list that keep you thriving and fulfilled?
So the poll's open. We'll just give everyone a few moments to answer. Obviously, same as the previous one, if you are going to select other, please drop your comments into the chat function and we'll be able to pass them on to Paula. Okay, we're almost there, so we'll close that and I'll share the results with you.
Lovely, thank you very much. So yeah, loads of different things on here. Oh gosh, I love this, being creative. Something that gives, it is, isn't it? It's one of those things that, you know, that creative energy gives us a chance to kind of, you know, fill ourselves up a little bit, doesn't it? And you've got different things in here about, you know, space to think and reflect. So important for leadership, and we're going to touch on that later. You've got things like reading and learning. That's fantastic. I'd expect nothing less from this audience. What's really interesting in here is there's a couple of things that do match. So what I wanted to highlight here really is that this is not necessarily attention all of the time. So there is another one major on here that you've filled out, which was achieving and delivering outcomes keeps you thriving and fulfilled. Well, that's also something that was in the expectations as well that some of you put down. So it could well be that actually some of our expectations as a leader also are those things that fill us up. So that's really, really good. It's good to know that about ourselves so that we can recognize that and celebrate that really. And also share that with other people when they look at us as leaders and think about, gosh, that looks overwhelming. Well, actually, it might look quite busy, but it might also be something that helps to fill us up. But what about some of the other things that don't necessarily do that? But, you know, some of you have also put solving problems on here is something that actually, you know, fills you up as well, keeps you thriving. So I think really illustratively on here, again, a real spread of things that work for you. But some of this is just really about asking yourself this question quite regularly. How much am I intention? And therefore, how much do I need to think about the way I approach my leadership? So it's just a little fun way of helping you to kind of make sense of that a little bit. And so just coming back to the presentation, you know, these expectations of leadership and keeping thriving and fulfilled, it's just a balance. It's a balance all the time of, in that complexity, how do we make sure that we are also staying on top of things ourselves? And so to some extent, that might require for us to take a little bit of a mindset shift to really think about and reflect upon how we lead to help ourselves stay in that thriving state. So as I said earlier, I wrote a book about this, and this is the book. And here's our leader. There's our leader with a little pair of glasses on, having a quick read of the book. And a lot of the concepts that I've put in here are really about what I would call a return to leadership. The favourite question that I have when I coach people and when I work with teams, and we're trying to simplify something that feels complicated, is getting back to a question, which is, what is the point? What's the point? And if we're a leader, asking ourselves that question, what is the point, can help us centre back on making sense of this complex world that we're leading in. So here's our leader. Oh, and I wanted to just share with you, I've just added in this slide. Sorry, I've added this in just at the last minute because I've been doing some research where I've been asking a number of leaders, all different levels, different sectors, different organisations, all about leadership. And I haven't actually written this research up yet, but there was one particular question that I thought I'd like to share with you as I've got the opportunity today. And I asked a question, which was, what are the main qualities for a leader in the 21st century? So move now and in the future. And so I wanted to share with you the answers that have come up consistently across all of these interviews, because it puts into context again the opportunity, I think, for us to think about leadership as a social and human endeavour. So self-awareness is one of the things that's come up. And we've just done a little exercise in self-awareness, but that whole sense of checking in with yourself, because your energy is your team's energy, and how people experience you is so important. They also talked about compassion. You will have heard probably quite a lot about the sort of sense of compassionate and kind leadership. The idea that empathy is really, really important. The idea that understanding things from different people's perspectives. So that sort of sense of compassion, having a growth mindset. So the idea that we don't know everything and that actually, we need to put ourselves in a position where we're constantly learning. And actually, lots of you put that in the poll, didn't you, about learning being something that fills you up. Authenticity is actually a word that's overused quite a lot, authentic leadership. It starts to sort of lose its meaning a bit, but genuinely what this means is, bringing yourself. And where I make sense of this is that people follow people. People don't follow a position. They might do, but they don't follow it with their hearts. So you don't get the whole of themselves. So people follow people. So the more you're able to represent yourself, the more people you will create a followership. Listening has come out as one of the things that this is really active listening. It's listening to hear and understand, not listening to respond. People talked a lot about humility being really important in leadership in the future. And transparency. So that idea that, although there may be some things which sometimes are by nature confidential, transparency is hugely important to help people understand what you understand. Building trust, creating environments. Building trust is the basis for a psychologically safe organisation. For people to feel safe to bring the best of themselves, you need to create that trustful environment. And curiosity is another sense that came through a huge amount. This sense, almost a bit like growth mindset, of seeking to understand before making assumptions or judgments. Being bold was a very interesting thing that's come up over and over again in these conversations. And what this means is not being bold as in necessarily being yes, you need to be assertive, but not necessarily about assertiveness or control. This is actually about standing for something. This is about representing something, being bold in what you stand for. Collaboration was a huge part that was coming up over and over again in these leadership interviews, that creating collaboration is the role of the leader. And making a difference. So actually doing something that makes a difference. It sort of goes back to my favourite question of what is the point? We can often get caught up in activities as leaders on a day-to-day basis, but do they really make a difference? Do they move the needle? And the three that came up the most of all of the things that people talked about in terms of the leadership qualities moving forwards was empathy, the ability to stand in someone else's shoes and see it from their perspective. Reducing complexity, so being able to take something that's complicated and simplify it, not add more complication to it. And agility, the ability to be able to shift opinion, change your mind, do something different very, very quickly, responding to the pace was absolutely there as well. So I wanted to just actually add that into this presentation to do it today, as this is just quite new and fresh, this research, but it gives you a sense of this return to leadership. The leader is actually all about, effectively the facilitation of an environment where everyone can thrive. And these are the types of things that enable you to create that environment. So here's our leader. And the job of the leader, so what's the point of the leader? Why does a leader exist? Well, the way I make sense of this is that a leader is there to move something from A to B. So if we are where we are today, the job of the leader is to move us to B. And that can play across the landscape. So I could work in a retail environment and I'm leading that retail environment, and I'm in a shop. And from the morning to the afternoon, we start and we end by selling stock and people have a great customer experience. That's my A to B, I'm leading that. I could be leading a massive multi-million-pound transformation program over the course of, 10 years or something. So, but leadership is always fundamentally about moving something and moving people from A to B. So if that's the outcome, what is it that the leader is actually doing? There's all those sorts of things we could be doing, but how could we simplify it? And my view is that when I look across my whole experience and all the leaders I've worked with, there are two main things, just simply two things that a leader needs to do. So if we sort of turn it a little bit into more of an equation, on one side there's our outcome, on the other side, the leader is creating clarity and getting out of the way, creating space. So there's literally two things that a leader is doing in order to create those outcomes. So all of that complexity, actually could be boiled down to these two things. So if you take all of that complexity, actually you can simplify it and think about it maybe from this perspective. And so if you think about those two aspects, they're really in balance. And I often think about it a little bit like the wings of a butterfly. So if you think about a butterfly who's in perfect flight, a butterfly is completely symmetrical. And really the job of the leader is to try and keep these two aspects of their job in balance and in symmetry. And so let's think about that from a 4-box grid. So if clarity is on one axis and getting out of the way is on the other, if I've got too much clarity, but I'm not out of the way enough as a leader, then I could potentially be being too directive. It could just be that everything requires me to do it because I'm here providing lots of clarity, but I'm also totally involved in everything. I don't know if anybody's worked for anyone like that. I have. But on the other side, actually, here I am. I'm out of the way. I'm letting people, they're empowered, they're doing what they want, but I haven't really clarified. There's no real parameters. Everybody's trying to work it out all the time. This can actually feel quite chaotic. There's no parameters within which people feel empowered. And in this bottom left-hand corner, if I don't have enough clarity and I'm also not out of the way, I'm not really leading. I'm participating in the team. I'm not really the leader of that team. What we're looking for is a leader in this sweet spot, a balance between creating clarity, enabling clarity, and getting out of the way and creating space. So that's our kind of overall balance. And then we can actually supercharge and multiply that activity. So what we're doing as a leader is we're creating clarity, we're getting out of the way, we've simplified it right back, we're doing those two things. And then there's additional superpower that enables us to do those things well and informs us. And I call those the vantage points. So, and I often think of anyone in a leadership position, wherever you are in the organization, you have the keys to the castle. You have the ability to see things from lots of different perspectives to help inform your ability to create clarity and to get out of the way. And so there's loads more information that we cover in the book on this. But I'm really interested in working out exactly what those vantage points are. But at this point, I'd really be interested, just a little pause for reflection again. I might be doing this in a slightly different slide, Paul, so that's fine, but let's just bring in poll 3 now. I'd love to just ask you, as a leader, how would you describe your approach? Do you tend to focus on clarity more? Do you tend to focus on getting out of the way more? Or do you tend to be relatively equal, or have you got an other? So just as we introduce that, I'd love to get a sense from you as to where you think you might be. And there's no right or wrong, and we can actually move between the two. So have a little think.
Excellent. So the poll's open. We'll just let everyone answer the poll. Just obviously to let everyone know the session is being recorded. And a week from today, you'll receive an email from Amber and PJ, which will include the link to access the recording. If you are going to select other during this poll questions, please type your answer into the chat function. Obviously, we'll be able to pass that on to Paula. We're pretty much there with the poll being complete by everyone. And just obviously let you know that the session will have the Q&A section at the end. So any questions, please type them in also. So we'll close the poll and we'll share the results with you, Paula. So you should be able to see those.
So that's brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody. Just your sort of initial reactions to that. So we've got a bit of a balance here. There's a sort of a slightly more focus on people thinking about clarity, um, and a little bit less people feeling that they are more focused on getting out of the way. And then about 40% of you thinking that you are more sort of more or less relatively equal. And as I say, there's not necessarily a right or a wrong to this, but if you have um, potentially thought, well, I tend to focus more on the clarity, well, I tend to focus more on the getting out of the way, it's just a reflection point. It's all about returning to that point of self-awareness, that, where you might jump in and highlight, oh, we could do it this way. Is there a question you could ask instead that encourages, because then you're developing muscle within the team to solve problems on their own and those types of things. So really helpful to just get your sense of where you feel you might be. So let's just jump into, and this is going to be really quite a whistle-stop tour, but I wanted to just give you a sense of the way I've thought about these different vantage points from the positions I've been in as a leader and also what I've seen from others. So the first vantage point I think about is in amongst. So this is, if you think about it, this is getting in amongst the work that is being done. So in your organization, in your team, there will be activity that people are participating in. Sometimes I go back to my manufacturing life and I would think about this if I was on a manufacturing line. This would be me being sort of almost going back to the floor, getting in amongst that work, doing some of those tasks. Not because I can do them better than anyone else, I probably can't actually, but just to be able to see it from that perspective and to understand what it feels like, and also to see what's going on and really observe. So all of these vantage points are giving you information. So in amongst is being right in amongst the work. The second one is to the side and around. So this is still at that level where the work is getting done. So say I'm in a call center and I'm responsible for that. I wouldn't be sitting taking calls like I might if I was in amongst or sitting next to someone. I'd be watching and seeing how that activity plays out. And again, I'd be able to use all my senses. I'd be able to see how it feels. I'd be able to look at what's happening, but I'd also be able to bring someone with me if I wanted to. I could share that vantage point and bring someone to also understand what their perspective might be of seeing what's happening with the work. So to the side and around. And I should say that in many sort of workplaces, you might think, oh, my work isn't practical like this. How do I get in amongst? How can I get to the side and around? There are always ways in which you are able to experience the work that your people are undertaking, or to observe the work that your people are undertaking in all sorts of different ways. And it's really important here. I actually have in the book, I have sort of the opportunities with each vantage point, but also the risks with them. It's really important to communicate what you're doing when you're to the side and around. Otherwise, people might feel that they're being watched. I mean, they are being watched, but not. It's more for your information gathering and to support people rather than sort of checking up on them. It's really important to communicate that. The third one I think about is that you've got this vantage point from high above. So you can literally look, across your team and see it from a sort of a higher perspective. So this could be anything from, the data that you receive can give you that vantage point, when you can see the performance of the team, but also being able to look at that holistically across the way that those sort of interactions work in your team, the handoffs between different parts of a process, for example, you can see all of that in its complete entirety. And then the next one is what I call from high out and beyond, which again is this ability that you've got not only to look in on the work, but also to step back, let the work carry on, and for you to look at the wider system, the adjacencies, the broader, might be the professional environment that you work in. It might be the industry that you work in. So it might be about sort of, this is the stuff that you read, this is the stuff that you access at conferences. It might be that you attend a meeting where you get to be able to participate with adjacent parts of the business or a competitive organization, whatever, bringing that information together and having that. And again, you can share this vantage point with others. You can bring others to look at it as well from their perspective to help you make sense of what you're seeing. And this is my favorite one, which is inside. And sometimes the one that, is challenging for us to find times to do. And interesting, when you answered the poll earlier, many of you did talk about that thriving and fulfilled piece being about finding space to reflect. Well, the inside vantage point is absolutely valid. Your gut feel, your experience, having the time to make sense of things before you communicate something or respond to something is super important. Remember, your energy is the energy of those around you. So if you do not have time for this vantage point and checking in with yourself, sometimes you can find that your reactions are actually played out in the organization before you've really made sense of them yourself. So this is a hugely important vantage point. So these are the 5 different sort of perspectives that as a leader you have access to almost uniquely. I mean, your team will have the in amongst, but they can't make sense of it against these other vantage points because they're not seeing those. And you've got the ability to see that, communicate and share that wider view. So our final poll of the session is actually on this slide, and I'm interested in just thinking about, as you just think about, we've gone through that very quickly, there's a lot more detail that I could share, but just for the purposes of today, I just wanted to broaden your horizon to thinking about it this way maybe. And the question is, if we can bring up the question here, of our final poll, question 4.
I'm trying to launch the poll. Sorry, Paula, but it's not launching for some reason.
Okay, well, what I'll do, I'll share with you what the question was and have a think about it. And if we can get it up, great. And if not, have a reflect on it anyway. So the question for this one I wanted you to just have a little think about was, as a leader, I would like to develop more my focus and time on. So this is more about, of these 5 different areas, is there one of these that you would particularly like to develop more, that perhaps you don't do so much of today? Because we all have preferences. Here we are, there's the poll. So we've all got a preference. We're likely to spend more time in some of these than others. Which of these are you interested in developing a little bit more and spending a little bit more time on? And the other thing I'll say, as you just complete that poll, the other thing I'll just say about that is that, say, for example, you've grown up in an organization and you were in a junior position, you've gone through the seniority and you're now a leader. You might have a preference for in amongst because it feels familiar, you know all the people, it feels really comfortable, you quite like it. It's quite fun to kind of be in amongst. But someone who's new to an organization, who actually has never worked in that environment and has come in as a leader, particularly potentially if you might be more of an introvert or something like that, for example, actually going in amongst might feel quite terrifying. Because you're sort of like, God, I don't know anyone. How do I going to feel? I might avoid it a little bit because it's actually quite uncomfortable for me. And so I might spend more of my time in some of the other areas. And it's all about how do we kind of challenge ourselves to give ourselves the broadest view. So I don't know, Paul, if the poll results are ready.
Yeah, you should be able to see the results now.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And it's a really good spread again, which is what I would expect actually to see, because we've all got different preferences. And what this tells us, first of all, is that it's highly likely that you as a leader will approach your leadership and the different vantage points from which you see things different to other leaders. So that's quite interesting when you come together as a group of leaders and you might have a really good sense of what's going on the ground. Someone else might have a really good sense of something else, and that's a really good opportunity for collaboration, but it's also an opportunity to miss each other in terms of communication. But equally, from high out and beyond seems to be the one that's sort of more likely as something that you want to develop. And I would say when I ask this question and I talk to leaders, what generally tends to come up is the 2 areas where people really don't spend as much time as they would like to is from high out and beyond and inside, because they're the 2 things that might feel slightly longer term and also possibly self-indulgent. And when I'm balancing that against what we talked about earlier in terms of, that the highest answer on what's expected of you as a leader is solving problems, that actually has some, potential, join up, doesn't it, between it? So thank you, Paul. That's great to get that poll there. So the final thing I just wanted to share with you, just before we move on, and I'm just trying to give you some of the concepts that I've kind of highlighted in the book. So we've talked about the clarity and the vantage point. I just wanted to introduce the concept of push leadership and magnetic leadership. And I've put the whole thing up here on the slide rather than build it. But let me just give you a sense of this. So we talked a little earlier about the balance between creating clarity and getting out of the way. And we've talked about how your vantage points can help you with those two jobs, to simplify what your role is as leader and to focus on, everything being really under the category of those two jobs. So here's a concept that I'm also interested in sharing with you that might enable you to free up that time to do more of that exploration of those vantage points. And that is the difference between push leadership and magnetic leadership. Sometimes when we think about push leadership, we might interpret this as being a little bit like command and control. And I don't mean that at all. I'm assuming that kind of the days of people generally feeling like they might be command and control leaders are not necessarily there. But control actually is an interesting concept. It can often mean that we are trying to reach for certainty in that complex landscape. And by reaching for that certainty, we are the generators of everything that needs to happen. It happens because of us. And this is when we're possibly up in that top left-hand corner of that grid where we're creating too much clarity and not getting out of the way enough. And that creates this push leadership, which requires the leader to do everything that happens requires you. And I've had so many conversations with leaders over the years, and I felt like this at myself at times, where I'm sort of like, God, there's nothing happening around here unless I make it happen. Those two people don't talk to each other unless I create the conditions for that to happen. And so you can end up sort of in this sort of cycle where you really need to create the energy. So this is all about energy. You are pushing the energy into the organization to help things to happen. So all good people around you, people really wanting to do the best that they can, but really relying on your energy to make that happen. So that's push leadership. And fundamentally, you can do that, but it can be absolutely exhausting. And also it doesn't leave a lot of space to manage this complexity of working lives. So the other alternative is actually to think about yourself more in a magnetic sense. So this is more about you as a leader being. So you are creating the parameters of clarity. You are constantly seeking to make sure that people understand and have a shared understanding of where you're going, why, what does it look like when you get there, and what's the work that needs to get done. 4 key questions for clarity. And then you yourself step back. So you are able to create the space for other people to work. And what that does is by having the clarity and creating space, people are attracted into doing that work. So the energy goes the other way. And that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, enabling you more and more space to spend time in those different vantage points, to create more clarity and to get out of the way more. So it's like a virtuous cycle. And creating that magnetic leadership means that you're not spending all of your time, creating the energy for the work to get done, but the energy is coming to you because you are creating the clarity and the conditions to do that. So I just wanted to share that as a concept as well. While we've got that, that's also in there. And it kind of brings us back to this overall equation, which is the simplification that says, if our job is to move things from A to B, then what are we doing? We could describe that big complex set of things, or we could say we're fundamentally running that balance between creating clarity and getting out of the way. And we're using our vantage points to superpower our ability to do that. And therefore, that is our beautiful kind of butterfly moment of leadership, that we can feel fulfilled and we can thrive and we can fly as a leader. And I have one final little exercise that I thought I'd just share with you as a pragmatic takeaway. So at the back of the book, there's actually a whole series of, I think there's 12 different tools in a toolkit that you can use to kind of bring this to life for yourself as a leader. One of those tools is a diary check. And this seems really, really simple. but actually it's quite powerful. And I use this with as most senior leadership as I possibly can, because in my experience, it's the most senior leadership that need to do this. But basically, the diary check would basically say, if you took your diary from the last 2 weeks and you looked at what you'd been doing, you would highlight, where did you spend your time? Just to give yourself that self-awareness again. What did I do effectively that provided clarity? So what were the things that I undertook during that week that actually created clarity? And what did I do to create space for others? So am I in balance? And then take your diary for the coming 2 weeks and be intentional about it, how you're going to spend your time. What could you change or rearrange to make sure that you're making the most of your vantage points? What did you learn from the last 2 weeks? How do you want to do that differently to make the most of those things? Based on our poll, if you particularly wanted to do more from above and beyond, how can you build that in? Can you make it happen? What opportunities will enable me to gain greater clarity, and how can I create more space for others? So forward looking, being intentional about that simplification of what leadership really means. So I've shared lots with you today. I hope that some of that's been interesting and given you food for thought to think about your own leadership style and how you create intention for leading and making a difference, and hopefully creating that simplification so that you can thrive and feel fulfilled as a leader and give that energy to others. So just as we finish, and I'm going to pass over to Paul shortly, this is the book, Vantage Points. You can contact me, that's my email address. I also have a website. My business is called Vantage Points Consulting. Obviously LinkedIn, I haven't put it on here, but if you want to get in touch with me on LinkedIn, I love to link in with people. And I also do a daily inspiration for leadership on Instagram. So you can follow me at the handle at Vantage Points Consulting and join the community there. And that's it. I'm very, very happy to take any questions. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Paula, for obviously a great session. Lots of great insights, and we've had some good questions come in. Just before we go to the questions, just to remind everyone, obviously the recording will be sent a week from today. And obviously, if you have any questions which you might have thought up after the session, please just send them in to the survey afterwards. Obviously, these will get passed on to Paul. And if you do have any questions throughout the Q&A section, please keep dropping them in. And if we do get time to answer these, we will. And obviously, any unanswered questions will get passed on to Paula herself. So we'll pass over to the questions. So the first question is, how do I, as a leader, provide clarity to my team when my manager is more of a manager rather than a leader and does not communicate? What is happening from high above?
Oh, this is such a great question. I've been asked this loads of times, actually. And it's really, really important because it's a realistic question, isn't it? It's probably what many of us might experience, which is this: we want to lead in a certain way, but how do we do that in a system that might not have that same cultural awareness? And a couple of things I want to say on that. One is, we are assuming, I think, sometimes that in our hierarchy, that the leaders above us have done the work. My experience would be, in many cases, that's not the case. So you may be feeling more enlightened as a leader about what makes a difference than you might be experiencing yourself. It's really challenging. Totally been there myself. Maybe I've even been that leader for someone else. I don't know. I think we have to be open to that thinking as well. So I think the first thing to say is, yes, this is a sort of a model and it has to exist in the real world. Couple of things that you can think about here that might be helpful, hopefully. One is, actually in the book is an expectations exercise, which I've found really, really super helpful. It's really straightforward. But instead of having a performance sort of conversation with your manager, it's quite helpful to have an expectations conversation with your manager that you can walk away with as much, hold them to account for giving you some clarity about what's expected and make it as easy as possible for them. My tip with dealing with leaders and managers is to make everything as easy as possible for them so that you get what you need. Because people are busy, or they might not even know to think about it from that perspective. So the expectations exercise is really about you saying to the lead, your boss, you know, and having a proactive conversation rather than waiting passively. This is what I think I'm doing. This is what I bring to it, and this is what I need from you. And also ask them what do they bring and what do they need. So what do they need from you and what do you need? And then actively really pay attention to what they need. So that, say, for example, they're a bit micromanaging around data or performance information. You know, in my experience, the best thing to do is try and deal with their need as much as you possibly can proactively. And then hopefully they can slightly get out of your way, or you can help them to get out of your way. And then the second tip is to create your own microclimate. So to create your own microclimate where you do as much of this as possible, and I'm sure you're doing this. That microclimate not only works with your team, but over time, because your team will then be higher performing, it's almost like wisps of effectiveness. That effectiveness starts to leak out from your team into the rest of the organization, and people will start to look at, well, what's happening here? So there's two things: expectation conversation with your manager to seek clarity, and then and working out what their expectations are to help them, you know, move out of your way so that you have space, and then creating your own microclimate, which in and of its own self will actually start to grow over time, is something that hopefully is helpful. But I think being as proactive as you possibly can. The line manager is not getting in your way on purpose. They don't know. So sometimes we have to be the teacher, and hopefully that's helpful.
Excellent, fantastic. So we'll go to the next question. So the question is, change has played a huge role in organizations over the last year or so. How can leaders best deal with uncertainty for themselves, but also for their team?
Yeah, I mean, I think this year has sort of meant we've always had uncertainty and change in organisations and for individuals, but I think the big difference with the last year or so has been it's been collective, hasn't it? So everybody's been through the same thing, and I think that's quite helpful. But I think it can also mean that where is the shore? You know, everybody feels at sea. So where can we see the shoreline? So it could be quite challenging. I think uncertainty and change is just, you know, we talked about that bigger context. I mean, that's not going away. That pace, that, you know, everything kind of being part of everything together, that whole context is not really going to change. And leadership really is about helping to navigate through those choppy waters. I think really the most important thing to do is to actually acknowledge it, because no leader should feel like they need to do this on their own. And actually, there's this expectation that the leader has all the answers, you know, is also not realistic either. That's the whole point of having a team. So I think we put up that slide based on my research that I've been doing, where you know I was able to share a few early thoughts on that, where you know you've got those different characteristics of leaders. I think that sort of humility, that sort of humbleness, that sense of being able to be vulnerable, to be authentic, to share it. Be surprised what your team will step up into when you give them the space to do it. If you're solving all of the problems and coping with it all on your own, there's no space for anybody to step in and support. So my biggest sort of, you know, just as a quick answer to your question would be acknowledgement of the uncertainty, and an open conversation about what everybody can bring to it.
Excellent, perfect. So we've got another question. So it is, how can a leader cultivate his or her visionary leadership skills, the skills that having the insightful vision that somebody can't see, but is very important to drive the business forward in the future?
What an amazing question. I love that one. So actually, when I coach people, we follow a little methodology which is called Pure Power Leadership. And it's based on three mechanisms of stages. So we first focus on pure, then pause, then power. Because actually, a leader that doesn't know the answer to that question, where are we going and where am I going and what does it mean to me, is going to be difficult to be authentic to create that followership. So that focus on pure is all about, what do I stand for? Where am I going? What do I want to do? and putting that in the context of then what their leadership challenge is. So asking that question of yourself is fantastic. So I think a couple of things. One is using that inside time or that out and beyond time to really gather information and to have that self-reflection. And I would say this probably, but I would have said it really whether I was, still in my chief people officer roles, that having a thinking partner to do that is really, really helpful, whether that's a buddy that you've got, whether it's a mentor, whether it's a coach, having that space to really make sense of it yourself so that you can explain it and why. The most important thing is why. Why am I doing this? What's the point? Getting back to those questions. Because once you understand that as a leader, you can lead it. Because you've got the ability to describe it to other people. And then I think the other thing I would say about that on a more practical note is cultivating your ability as a leader to tell stories is really important. And there's all sorts of ways in which you can practice that and watch people who do it well. But if you want to inspire other people towards something, putting it into the context of how it will feel and taking them on a sort of a journey of a story is really powerful versus sort of it being a bit dry and factual. So the job of a visionary leader, if you think about anybody who inspires you, it's likely that they're telling stories. So how would you tell the story? And then the final thing I would say is, do you feel excited? Because if you feel excited about what you're doing, we talked about your energy as your team's energy. Your excitement will be infectious. But if you're not excited and you don't believe in something, it's going to be quite hard work, isn't it? So yeah, those are the sorts of things I would share around that.
Excellent, fantastic. I think we've got time for one last question. It's quite a nice question to end on. So it's from your experience, how has leaders and their traits changed over the past 5 years? And how do you see the future of leadership in 5 years' time?
Oh, yeah, lovely question. It's part of the reason why I did the research, actually, was also to get some collective brains on that second part of the question, where's it going? So what would I say over the past, well, I've been working with leaders for 25 years. I do think there has been a shift in the more recent time, and I think it's where it is actually about all of those things that we put on that slide that came from the research. It's about moving from task to moving to creating followership through yourself and your energy, seeing people as people. So I think that's come through because people have been a bit more vulnerable. I think leaders have stopped feeling the need to have the answers and ask more questions. I genuinely think I'm seeing more leaders doing that. I'm seeing more leaders who are just a bit kinder to themselves and to everybody around them. So I definitely am seeing shifts in that. I'm also seeing some people who are, haven't quite caught up with that yet. But I definitely have seen more of that, and people trying really hard to do that. And the recognition that I just can't keep running on this treadmill with the speed going up and up and up. We have to find a different way of doing this. We have to share the running. We have to share the speed. I can't do it all on my own from the front. So I'm seeing that. In terms of the future, and I've spoken about this a number of times, and it's borne out really in the research, is that if you think about it, over the last 200 years, we've gone through this sort of phase of what humans do in relation to work. So when we industrialized, humans were the machines. I mean, we were the horsepower. It was all about just being cogs in the wheel to kind of create an outcome. That got automated. And then we moved into the sort of the knowledge base. I'm going really quickly through history, but effectively we went to then the knowledge based thing, and we were performing tasks. Different people were performing knowledge based tasks, and the role of the leader was to kind of coordinate all of those tasks. But with AI and robotics and changes in sort of intelligence in the way that systems are able to help us, we're in a really exciting place where we are shifting into what I would call the human leadership. We are almost returned back to the things that have enabled humans to thrive as a species, which is creativity, socialization, and community. And those things are the things that have enabled us to be, you know, the race that we are, the human race. And we've almost been able to return back to it because automation has caught up with us again. And so now we're in the business of making the most of human to human interaction and human to machine interaction. So the job of the leader is human. And when I talked at the beginning about that societal change, any leader who is managing task over managing humans is going to find themselves very quickly out of pace. And understanding the human being, how to motivate humans, how we show up, how we kind of appreciate each other and make the best of each other, that is leadership of the future. And that was definitely borne out by the research as well. So it's a movement into human leadership from task leadership. The task will be taken care of by the automation and our ability to cooperate together.
Excellent, fantastic. Obviously, we've run out of time for this session. I think we could keep going and going with the questions. There's lots coming in, lots of great things. Obviously, in the chat, there's been some great feedback. Everyone's showing their praise. They've really enjoyed the session, found it very insightful and informative, and obviously great to obviously have you speak today, Paula. Just to let everyone know, we've got our next webinar taking place on the 5th of October at 12 p.m. That's with Jens Schadendorf, and he'll be presenting on gaming chambers at work, how the LGBT plus community and their allies are changing the global economy. So if you'd like to attend that session or any of the other scheduled webinars we have, then please head over to www.associationofmbas.com and you'll be able to complete the registration form and obviously see all the scheduled webinars there. So lastly, what's all left to say is thank you, Paula, for a great session and obviously taking the time out to present today. And we look forward to seeing everyone at our next webinar or webinar in the future. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.